He had always thought of the land as quiet, patient, and loyal. It had been there long before the streets were paved, before the rows of matching houses showed up, before the neighborhood signs with polished stone and shiny lettering were planted at the entrance. The land did not ask for attention. It did not complain. It simply existed, waiting the same way it had for decades. The property sat just beyond a fast-growing subdivision. On one side were neat homes with trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. On the other side was his land, open and uneven, dotted with old trees and wild grass that grew the way it wanted. Some people saw it as empty. To him, it was history. It was proof. It was security. He came by often, sometimes just to walk the edges, sometimes to sit in his truck and look out across it. He didn't farm it or build on it. He never rushed to develop it, even when real estate prices began climbing and people started talking about opportunity. He believed land didn't lose value just because it stayed quiet. In his mind, doing nothing was sometimes the smartest move. Years earlier, when he first took ownership, he made sure everything was done the right way. The deed was clear. The boundaries were marked. Taxes were paid on time, every year, without fail. The paperwork went into a thick folder that he kept in a locked drawer at home. It wasn't something he thought about often, but he liked knowing it was there. The neighborhood next door was run by a homeowners association. Everyone knew it. The HOA controlled paint colors, fence height, mailbox styles, and even how long a trash bin could sit near the curb. People joked about it, complained about it, but followed the rules anyway. The HOA meetings were known to be long and tense, but he never attended them. He didn't have to. His land wasn't part of the neighborhood, and he wasn't a member at least. That's what he believed. From time to time, he noticed changes. New survey flags appeared near the edge of the development. Trucks drove by more often. He heard talk at local stores about expansion, about new phases, about how the area was growing faster than anyone expected. None of it worried him. Growth happened everywhere. It didn't mean it was coming for his land. One afternoon, while standing near the fence line, he noticed something different. Wooden stakes were placed farther out than usual. They didn't look random. They were evenly spaced, like someone was measuring something carefully. He stood there for a long time, hands on his hips, staring at them. He told himself it was probably a mistake. Surveyors cross lines all the time. It would be cleared up days past. Then weeks. The stakes stayed. He called the county office to ask if there had been any changes to zoning or boundaries. The person on the phone gave short answers and transferred him twice. Eventually, he was told there was no issue listed under his parcel number. That should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Something felt off. The HOA sign at the neighborhood entrance was updated soon after. A small banner appeared beneath it, announcing future community expansion. No details. No dates. Just a promise of more houses, more streets, more people. He stared at the sign longer than he meant to. The word future felt heavy. Still no one contacted him directly. No letters. No calls. No requests to buy the land or discuss plans. That silence bothered him more than anything else. If someone wanted his property, they would ask. That's how things worked. Or at least that's how they were supposed to. He went back to the land one evening near sunset. The sky was low and orange, the shadows long. From where he stood, he could see children playing in the neighborhood, their laughter carrying across the open space. He had nothing against them. He didn't hate the homes or the people living there. But he felt a line had been drawn, even if no one had said it out loud. He walked the boundary slowly, counting steps, matching landmarks with memory. A certain tree that leaned slightly to the left. A patch of rocks near the corner. Everything was where it had always been. The land hadn't moved. Only the intentions around it had. That night, he pulled the old folder from the drawer. Dust came off the top as he set it on the table. Inside were yellowed pages, stamps, signatures, and maps folded more times than he could count. He spread them out carefully, like fragile pieces of a puzzle. The deed was there, clear and official, with language that felt firm and final. Reading it again gave him a small sense of relief. This land, he thought, is still mine. Over the next few weeks, the activity increased. More vehicles. More people walking the edge of the property with clipboards. Once, someone waved at him from a distance, then quickly turned away. No one introduced themselves. No one explained what they were doing. It felt like being watched without being acknowledged. Neighbors from the development began stopping him when they saw him nearby. Some asked casual questions. Others made comments that didn't sit right. "They're saying there'll be a lot of new homes back here," one person said. Nodding toward his land like it was already decided, he responded calmly, telling them the land was privately owned. Most looked surprised. A few looked confused. One shrugged and said, "That's not what we heard." Those words stuck with him. Not what we heard. It meant stories were already being told, plans already being shared, without him included. It meant someone had spoken for his land without permission. He tried to attend a local planning meeting held at a community center. He sat quietly in the back, listening. A presentation was given about housing needs, growth, and development. Maps were shown on a screen. When one map appeared, his chest tightened. The outline looked familiar. Too familiar? The land was colored in as part of a future phase. He raised his hand to speak, but the meeting moved on quickly. Questions were limited. Time ran out. People clapped. The officials smiled and thanked everyone for coming. As the room emptied, he stood there feeling invisible. Outside, he took a deep breath. He wasn't angry yet. He was confused. And confusion, he knew, could be dangerous if left alone too long. Driving home, he replayed everything in his mind. The stakes. The banner. The map. The comments. None of it added up, and yet all of it pointed in the same direction. Something was happening, and it wasn't small. He stopped at a red light and looked at the sky darkening above the streetlights. He realized this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about being erased quietly, without a fight, without a conversation. That thought bothered him more than the possibility of losing property. At home, he made copies of his documents. He labeled folders. He wrote dates down. He started a simple notebook and logged everything he could remember. Times, locations, conversations. It felt strange, like preparing for something he never wanted to face. But he trusted his instincts. The land had been quiet for years. But now it felt like it was calling for attention. Not loudly. Not desperately. Just firmly, and he knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. He had barely settled back into his normal routine when the first letters arrived. At first, they looked official, stamped and sealed with the HOA's emblem. He picked them up from the mailbox one afternoon, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The envelopes were thicker than normal, and when he opened the first one, the words inside made his hands tremble slightly. They claimed ownership, control, and the right to develop his land. They mentioned permits, plans, and approvals for 96 homes. The number seemed unreal, like something from a dream, but the weight of it pressed down on him in a way he couldn't ignore. He read the letter several times, trying to find a mistake. Perhaps a wrong name. Perhaps a typo. Perhaps a line he could dismiss. But every sentence repeated the same claim. The land was no longer his. He felt his chest tighten and his throat dry. He had a clear deed, older than the HOA itself, proving his ownership. Still, here they were, asserting the opposite, moving forward as if he didn't exist. The next morning, he decided to confront someone directly. He drove to the HOA office, a low brick building with neatly trimmed shrubs and a parking lot full of cars that gleamed in the sunlight. He stepped inside, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. A receptionist looked up from behind a polished desk. "I received letters about my property," he said. "I need to speak to someone in charge." The receptionist nodded, typing quickly. "Mr. Daniels?" she asked. "Yes," he said, giving his full name. After a long pause, she handed him a form and said someone would meet him. An older man with a suit that looked slightly too tight appeared minutes later. He introduced himself as the HOA's project manager. His handshake was firm but brief. "We've reviewed the area," the man began. and it's clear that the property in question falls under the community development plan. I own this land, he said, his voice rising slightly. I have a deed recorded decades ago. You cannot just claim it. The man's expression remained neutral. We have permits and approvals from the county. There's nothing you can do at this point except discuss options. He wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. Options meant compromise. Options meant negotiation. But this wasn't negotiation. This was an attempt to take what he had worked to protect his whole life. He left the office with a heavy heart. Walking back to his truck, he noticed the stakes had returned to the edges of his land. Surveyors were measuring again, marking boundaries as if his ownership didn't exist. He felt a rush of anger, but he swallowed it. Anger wasn't enough. He needed facts. He needed proof. Back home, he spread the letters and papers across the dining table. He read each one, underlining phrases, circling dates, writing notes in the margins. He realized quickly that the HOA was relying on recent zoning changes and interpretations of property maps. They claimed that somewhere along the way, his land had become part of a larger parcel controlled by the association. None of it made sense to him. He had never sold it. He had never agreed to anything. The days that followed were tense. He started seeing strangers walking near his property more often. Sometimes they wore vests, sometimes they carried clipboards. Once a man in a bright orange vest stopped and asked if he could take pictures of the land for official purposes. He refused. The man left, shrugging, and later he noticed the photos had appeared in an online planning document. Someone was moving forward, regardless of his objections. Neighbors began asking questions too. They approached him casually, curious, nervous, or maybe trying to gather information for themselves. They're saying construction will start soon, one said. Glancing around like they were afraid of being overheard, he nodded politely, not revealing how worried he truly was. He couldn't trust anyone fully, not even neighbors who seemed friendly. Some were too eager to believe the HOA, too willing to accept what they heard from meetings or emails. He realized quickly that he would have to fight this alone, with proof and patience. Late one night, he sat at his kitchen table with a flashlight, scanning the maps and legal documents. The house was quiet, the streets outside empty, the air heavy with anticipation. His mind kept returning to one thought. They were trying to erase him from his own land, and they believed they could do it quietly, without challenge. He decided he needed professional help. The next day, he contacted a local attorney known for handling property disputes. The lawyer agreed to review his case immediately. They spent hours poring over the deed, the HOA's letters, county records, and the recent zoning documents. Every detail mattered. Every date could become a piece of evidence. I've seen cases like this, the attorney said finally, leaning back in his chair. It's unusual, but your deed is strong. Older than any current HOA claims. If it's properly recorded, it gives you a solid foundation to challenge their right. He felt a flicker of hope. Solid foundation. That's what he needed. The idea that decades-old papers could stop modern development seemed almost too good to be true. Yet here it was. The following week, he tried to communicate with the HOA again, this time with his attorney copying every letter. He demanded a meeting to discuss the dispute formally. The response came quickly, a refusal. The HOA insisted that the land was part of their development plan and that no discussion could change that. It became clear to him that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was an aggressive move to take the land. He realized he had to prepare for a long fight, and the earlier he started, the better at home. He walked the property again, taking photos and making notes of every corner. Every tree, every landmark mentioned in the deed. He began keeping a daily log of activity near the land. Trucks, surveyors, visitors. Every detail might matter in the months ahead. One afternoon, he spotted a surveyor measuring near the edge of the property. He approached cautiously. "This is private land," he said. The surveyor looked up, clearly startled. "I'm just doing my job," the man said, glancing at a clipboard. "You have no right to be here," he replied firmly. The surveyor hesitated, then nodded, moving away. It was a small victory, but but it reinforced a harsh reality. People were testing the boundaries, seeing how far they could go. And he couldn't let them cross the line. By now, the letters from the HOA had increased in number. Some were polite in tone, others more threatening. They mentioned future litigation and development rights, words designed to intimidate. He read each carefully, responded through his attorney, kept copies in a growing stack on his desk. Friends and family began to notice the stress weighing on him. They offered advice, suggestions, and sometimes skepticism. Some told him to sell the land to avoid trouble. Others encouraged him to fight. He appreciated their concern, but the decision was his alone. This wasn't just land. It was history, identity, and something he refused to give up. As the weeks turned into months, the tension grew. He would drive by the property and notice construction plans being discussed, machines being moved, signs of preparation. It was like watching a storm form on the horizon, knowing it would soon reach him directly. One evening, after another tense day of letters and phone calls, he sat alone on the land as the sun dipped behind the distant homes. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the grass in waves. He felt a mixture of anger, fear, and determination. He realized that no one was coming to save him. No one would stop this for him automatically. If he wanted to protect what was rightfully his, he would have to do it himself. He made a silent promise to the land. He would fight, not with anger alone, but with every bit of evidence, every legal tool, and every careful step he could take. The letters from the HOA had been bold, their claims aggressive, but they had underestimated him. They had overlooked one critical thing: his ownership, his history, his deed, and he would make sure they never forgot it. He knew he couldn't fight blindly. Letters and meetings hadn't worked, warnings and refusals hadn't worked, and passive hope certainly wouldn't work. The next step was clear. He had to dig into the history of his land, every record, every note. Every document that could prove it had always been his. He began at the county records office, a quiet building with the faint smell of old paper and ink. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stacked with folders and maps dating back decades. He spent hours sifting through old deeds, property maps, and land surveys. Every page told a story of the land's past, of owners who had cared for it, sold it, or passed it down through generations. He kept thinking about how easy it would have been for the HOA to assume no one would notice a small detail. An old paper, a tiny signature. But he was paying attention now. One day, buried in a folder that looked almost forgotten, he found something remarkable. It was a deed older than he remembered, recorded long before the HOA even existed. The type of paper that smelled faintly of ink and time. It was precise and formal, with handwritten notes in the margins and official stamps that had faded but were still legible. As he read it, his heart began to beat faster. Every line confirmed what he had always believed. The land belonged to him entirely. It had never been included in any HOA agreement or subdivision plan. The language was clear, almost defiant in its simplicity. It specifically described the land boundaries, the rights of ownership, and restrictions on any future claims. Nothing was vague. Nothing could be twisted. The deed was solid. Older than zoning changes, older than the construction plans, and older than any rules the HOA claimed to rely on. He made copies immediately, handling the paper carefully. Each page felt like a weapon in a quiet war. For years, the land had been waiting. Now, he had proof that could stop the storm before it destroyed everything he owned. Next, he turned to maps. Some were hand-drawn, yellowed with age, showing the land and its neighbors. Others were printed, showing roads, property lines, and subdivisions planned decades later. By comparing them, he could see clearly where the HOA's claims had gone wrong. They had assumed his land was part of a larger parcel, but the maps showed otherwise. His property had its own distinct borders. Separate from the HOA development, he started creating his own timeline, documenting the land's ownership history. Each previous owner, each transaction, each boundary adjustment was carefully noted. It was meticulous work, sometimes frustrating, sometimes exhilarating. Every detail he recorded became another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall protecting his land at home. He spread everything across the dining table. Letters, maps, old deeds, notes, photographs of survey stakes and construction equipment. The house felt like a small office of legal research. Every time he looked at the collection, he felt both hope and the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for justice, for truth, for the right to exist where he had always existed. He met with his attorney again. They went through every document he had uncovered. The attorney nodded slowly as each piece of evidence was explained. Each line of the deed read aloud. "This is stronger than I expected," the attorney said. "The deed predates everything the HOA is claiming. If we present this properly, it could end the case before construction even begins." A sense of relief washed over him, but it was tempered by caution. The HOA wouldn't give up easily. They had too much at stake. 96 homes, developers, future profits. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time he felt he had a true chance. Next, he decided to gather more evidence. He visited the property repeatedly, photographing landmarks mentioned in the deed. A certain tree that leaned slightly, a cluster of rocks. The small slope near the corner, everything matched the old descriptions perfectly. He even found a faint stone marker near one edge that appeared in the earliest maps. Each photo was dated and labeled, creating a visual record that matched the legal documents. He also interviewed neighbors who had lived in the area for decades. Some remembered when the land had changed hands, when surveyors had marked boundaries, and when the original owners had cared for it. Their stories added human context, supporting the written evidence. They didn't know about the HOA's current plans, but they remembered the land as it had always been a private, independent property. As the evidence grew, so did his confidence. He realized that the key wasn't just anger or frustration. It was clarity and proof. The HOA had relied on assumptions, on the idea that people wouldn't look closely. He was looking closely, and the truth was in his favor. But there was a moment of doubt, too. One afternoon, he noticed a new fence being put up near the edge of his land. Contractors were measuring, hammering stakes, and driving posts into the ground. His heart sank. Even with the deed, even with the maps, the physical presence of construction felt threatening. He wondered how far they would go without permission. He called the attorney immediately. They discussed filing a temporary injunction to stop any work until the case could be resolved. The attorney assured him it was possible, but it required quick action and proper documentation. He spent the rest of the day gathering evidence, photographs, and written notes for the legal filing. Every moment felt urgent. Every misstep could cost him ground. During this period, he also took care to document every interaction with the HOA emails. Phone calls, letters, even casual conversations were logged carefully. Dates, times, and summaries of what was said were noted in a dedicated notebook. He knew that when the legal battle began, every detail could matter. Even small inconsistencies in the HOA's claims could be used to strengthen his case. He also paid attention to zoning laws and county regulations. Every clause, every requirement, every permit was reviewed. He discovered several technical errors in the HOA's filings permits that didn't fully comply with local rules, approvals that were incomplete, references that didn't match the property records. Each discovery felt like a small victory, proof that his preparation was paying off. At night, he often sat in his living room, staring at the stack of papers and maps. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but so was a growing sense of purpose. This was more than property. It was history, legacy, and principle. He thought about the original owners, about the families who had cared for this land, and about the future he wanted to protect. Sometimes he imagined the courtroom. He saw the judge reviewing the old deed, comparing it to the HOA's claims and recognizing the truth. He saw himself presenting the evidence carefully, explaining the history, the maps, the boundaries. It was a visualization exercise, but it helped him stay focused. He needed to believe in the possibility before he could make it real. He also realized he needed public support. The more people who understood the situation, the more attention it would receive, and the less likely the HOA could act quietly. He reached out to a local journalist, sharing the basic facts without revealing sensitive legal strategies. The journalist was intrigued and promised to cover the story if it developed further. Weeks turned into months as he continued gathering evidence, preparing for the inevitable legal battle. The land had been patient for decades, and now he was learning to be patient too, but with purpose. Every document found, every map compared, every neighbor spoken to, every photo taken added strength to his position. Finally, after long days of work, a moment of quiet satisfaction arrived. He sat back, looking at the evidence laid out on his table. Every piece fit together. Every fact supported the same conclusion: the land was his, and nothing the HOA claimed could override the clear recorded deed. He knew the fight was coming. He knew the courtroom would be tense, that the HOA would argue, appeal, and resist. But he felt ready. For the first time since the letters arrived, he believed that the land would remain in his hands. The storm was approaching, but he had built a fortress of facts, history, and proof. The old deed, forgotten for decades, was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a shield. It was a voice speaking for the land itself. And it was going to be the key to stopping the HOA's bold claim. The land had waited quietly all these years, and now it had an advocate. He would fight, not out of anger alone, but out of respect for the truth. Every step he had taken, every detail recorded, every map compared, had led to this moment. The battle was still ahead, but for the first time, he knew he held the advantage. The next phase would be the courtroom, where the deed would speak louder than words, where history would challenge power, and where 96 homes were at risk of being stopped by a single, undeniable truth. The day of the court hearing arrived with a weight he could feel in his chest. He had spent months gathering every document, every map, every photograph, every note that could prove the land was his. Now he would face the homeowners association in a courtroom that smelled faintly of varnish and paper, with polished wood panels and a bench where the judge would decide the future of his property. He drove there early, arriving before anyone else, and parked in a lot that was still empty in the soft morning light. He walked through the courthouse slowly, carrying a thick binder with all of his evidence. The quiet halls seemed colder than usual, echoing each step. His stomach tightened with anticipation. The reality was sinking in. This was not just a fight over land anymore. It was a fight over recognition, over authority, over the simple right to exist without being erased. Inside the courtroom, he took a seat near the front, carefully arranging his materials on the desk in front of him. Across the room, representatives from the HOA were already gathered, their files neat, their expressions calm, almost calm. They had confidence on their side, backed by permits, county approvals, and plans for 96 homes. But he had something stronger: the truth, recorded decades ago in a deed that could not be ignored. The judge entered, stern figure with sharp eyes that seemed to look straight through everyone in the room. The proceedings began with formalities, the usual introductions and confirmations. He listened closely, his mind scanning every detail, noting how the HOA presented their argument. They spoke of development plans, community needs, zoning changes, and approvals. They had graphs, maps, and documents carefully stacked on the table. When it was his turn, felt a mix of nerves and determination. He stood slowly, holding the binder firmly in his hands, and began presenting his case. He started with the history of the land, recounting every previous owner and explaining how each transaction had been properly recorded. He showed maps that clearly marked the boundaries and photos that matched the landmarks. Described decades ago, the judge examined the old deed carefully. Every line, every signature, every stamp was scrutinized. The HOA's attorney tried to interrupt at times, suggesting that the deed was irrelevant or outdated. But the judge held firm, insisting that the document be considered fully. The weight of history filled the room, quiet yet undeniable force that could not be brushed aside as he spoke. He noticed a few of the HOA representatives whispering among themselves. Their confident expressions wavered slightly when he laid out each piece of evidence. The photographs of trees, rocks, and corners were simple, yet powerful. The maps from decades past contradicted the claims they were making now. The deeds and records were official and undeniable. Witnesses were called next. Neighbors who had lived in the area for decades described how the land had always been independent, maintained by its owners, never part of the HOA's plans. Their statements were straightforward, honest, and full of personal memory. Each recollection reinforced the same truth. The land belonged to him, not the association. The HOA presented their own witnesses. Planners and surveyors who had worked on the development project. They spoke of measurements, permits, and approvals, but every detail was challenged by the evidence he had gathered. The maps they referenced were incomplete or misinterpreted. Their measurements didn't match the historical records. The permits, when examined closely, had small technical errors that weakened their claims. The courtroom grew tense. Every time the HOA attempted to claim authority, his attorney countered with historical evidence. Each piece of paper, each photograph, each testimony chipped away at the facade the HOA had tried to build. It became clear that their argument relied on assumptions rather than facts. They had acted quickly, assuming the land would be accepted as part of the development. But they had overlooked the one thing they could not ignore: documented history. He watched the judge's face carefully. There was a moment when the judge leaned forward, squinting at a corner of the deed, then at a map, then back at the binder. He could see a shift in understanding, a recognition that the evidence was clear and compelling. The land had been overlooked, yes. The law and history were on his side. During a brief recess, he stepped outside the courtroom and took a deep breath. The sun was warm, the air carried the faint smell of winter leaves, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel relief. This wasn't over, but the tide was turning. Months of preparation, patience, and careful attention had brought him to this point. He felt the land behind him, silent yet steadfast, as if it was standing with him, waiting for justice to be acknowledged. Back inside, the hearing resumed. Closing arguments were made with precision. The HOA emphasized community growth and potential benefits for the neighborhood, trying to appeal to practical concerns. But the response was clear. Benefits cannot override legal ownership, cannot erase recorded deeds, and cannot invalidate the history of a property. His attorney presented the final point, that 96 homes could not be built on land that legally was not theirs. The statement hung in the air, simple, undeniable, yet powerful. The judge asked questions, probing both sides, testing the claims and counterclaims. He answered carefully, referencing the deed, the maps, and the photographs. He spoke plainly, without anger, without emotion, but with conviction. Every point made was backed by facts, every question answered with history and documentation. He could feel the judge's attention focused, deliberate, weighing every word. After hours of deliberation in the courtroom, the judge announced that the construction could not proceed until a final ruling was made. It was a temporary victory, a pause that prevented the HOA from moving forward while the court considered the evidence fully. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with the understanding that the final decision would still take time. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but he also knew that momentum had shifted in his favor. The judge scheduled additional hearings, allowing for detailed examination of the deeds, maps, and legal arguments. During these days, he continued documenting the land, taking additional photos and recording every detail. He stayed in close contact with his attorney, refining arguments and preparing for every possible question. Every step was careful, deliberate, and focused on one goal: to prove that his land could not legally be claimed by anyone else. Neighbors and some local supporters began to notice his efforts. A few offered assistance, sharing old photographs or memories of the land that further confirmed its independence. Others followed the case quietly, intrigued by the unfolding drama. He welcomed the support cautiously, knowing that the courtroom outcome depended on facts, not opinions. Yet he appreciated the quiet encouragement from the community, the HOA. In response, attempted to introduce new evidence, including updated surveys and permits. But each submission was carefully examined by his attorney, who found inconsistencies and errors. The process was slow and meticulous, requiring patience and careful attention to every detail. At times, it was exhausting. But he reminded himself why he was fighting, not for attention, not for pride, but for the simple truth that his land belonged to him, and that it should not be taken by assumption or force. Late one evening, after another long day in court and meetings with his attorney, he walked the land alone. The sun had set, the sky dark and clear, stars beginning to shine. He ran his hand along a familiar tree trunk, looked at the familiar rocks, and felt a sense of calm. The land had been patient, quiet, and steady. Now, justice was moving slowly, but it was moving. He felt a connection deeper than before, a sense that the land itself was part of the battle, standing silently beside him, waiting for recognition. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Every session drew more attention, and the stakes grew higher with each argument. The HOA representatives were no longer as confident. They had underestimated the importance of historical records and the strength of clear legal documentation. They had assumed momentum was on their side, but the tide had turned, slowly but unmistakably. Finally, after several hearings, the judge reviewed all the evidence thoroughly. The deed, the maps, the photographs, the testimonies, the recorded history all pointed to one truth. Ownership had been clearly established long before the HOA existed, and no modern permits or development plans could override that reality. When the judge spoke, the room was silent. Every word was deliberate. The ruling recognized the validity of the deed, the independence of the land, and the improper claim made by the HOA. The judge noted that while development plans could continue elsewhere, this specific property could not be included, and any further attempts to claim it without consent would be invalid and potentially illegal relief. Quiet and profound settled over him. Years of concern, months of preparation, weeks of tension, and hours in the courtroom had all led to this moment. The land had been acknowledged, its ownership respected, and the attempts to take it halted. It was not just a legal victory, it was a personal one, proof that patience, preparation, and persistence could overcome even the most aggressive opposition. As he left the courtroom, the sunlight was warm on his face. The wind moved gently through the trees on the edge of the property. He felt the land beneath his feet, solid and real, a reminder of why he had fought so hard. 96 homes would not rise here. His land remained his. The battle had been difficult, exhausting, and stressful, but it was won. He knew the HOA could still appeal, that challenges might come later, but the foundation was now unshakable. The deed, the history, and the proof were undeniable. For the first time since the letters had arrived months ago, he felt calm, confident, and ready for whatever might come next. And as he looked out across the familiar open space, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The land had waited. He had fought. And justice at last had begun to acknowledge the truth. Months of waiting, uncertainty, and preparation had finally come to an end. The courtroom had confirmed what he had always known. The land was his. And no HOA, no development plan, and no permits could change that. But the final step, the ultimate confirmation of victory, would come with the judge's final ruling. He arrived at the courthouse early that day, carrying his old binder of deeds, maps, and photographs, feeling a mix of exhaustion, relief, and quiet anticipation. Inside, the courtroom was calm but tense. The HOA representatives were there, a little less confident than before. Their files neatly stacked, their expressions tense. They had fought hard, confident that the weight of numbers permits approvals. Development plans would eventually carry the day. But they had overlooked one simple truth: facts, evidence. And history were stronger than assumptions. The judge entered, a calm figure whose presence filled the room with authority. All eyes turned forward. He felt a deep breath settle in his chest. The land he had cared for, protected, and documented for years had led him here. Now, it was time for closure. The proceedings began with a recapitulation of the case. The judge outlined the claims of the HOA, the arguments of his attorney, and the evidence that had been presented over weeks of hearings. The deed, maps, photographs, and testimonies were all acknowledged, reviewed carefully, and considered. Every document he had gathered, every painstaking detail he had recorded, was being weighed in front of a judge who understood their significance. When the judge spoke, his words were deliberate. He noted that the deed predated the HOA, that the land had been properly recorded and continuously owned, and that any attempts to claim it without consent were invalid. He emphasized that the land's legal status was clear, that the historical documents and visual evidence supported it, and that the HOA had no authority to build on it. A wave of relief washed over him. Months of tension, late nights, visits to county offices, and countless hours spent organizing evidence had led to this. His patience, persistence, and careful attention had paid off. This was not just a legal victory. It was a personal triumph, proof that one person, armed with truth and determination, could stand up against powerful organizations, the judge continued, detailing that any existing permits issued for construction on his property were null and void. Any future attempts to develop the land without his explicit permission would be illegal. The HOA would face consequences if they attempted to ignore the ruling. The 96 homes that had been planned for his land were effectively stopped, at least for this property. He listened quietly, almost in disbelief. The land had been quiet for decades, and now it had been heard, recognized, and protected. He imagined the trees, the wild grass, the rocks, and the gentle slope of the land. It's all standing quietly, unchanged, yet validated by the court. Every photograph, every map, every note he had made seemed to matter more than ever. The land was no longer just empty space. It was proof of his patience and diligence. The HOA representatives looked stunned. Their confident demeanor had faded, replaced by the realization that their plans had been halted. They had underestimated the importance of historical documents and proper ownership. They had assumed momentum was on their side, that permits and plans could override legal rights, but they had been proven wrong. Outside the courtroom, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and joy. The sun was shining, and the air felt lighter than it had in months. He walked to the edge of his land, the boundary marked by familiar trees and rocks. He ran his hand along the rough bark of a tree that had stood there longer than he had known. He felt a deep connection to the land, stronger than ever. It had been quiet, patient, and resilient, and now it had been protected. Neighbors and friends began approaching him, offering congratulations and expressing relief. Some admitted they had doubted whether the fight could be won. Others were amazed at how one person, armed with documents and determination, could stop an entire development. He smiled quietly, appreciative but focused. This had never been about proving anything to others. It had been about protecting something that was his, and about respecting history, truth, and fairness. The weeks that followed were filled with small but meaningful actions. The survey stakes that had marked the edges of his property were removed. Construction crews no longer appeared, and the plans for 96 homes no longer included his land. The HOA, faced with a clear legal decision, began to retreat, revising their development plans to exclude his property entirely. Even with the legal victory, he continued to monitor the land carefully. He knew that complacency could allow mistakes or oversights to occur. He visited regularly, taking photographs and making notes, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he had fought to protect. Every tree, every patch of grass, every familiar rock now carried additional significance. They were symbols of patience, resilience, and victory. The media coverage, small as it was, highlighted the story as an example of careful preparation and legal diligence. Some neighbors and local residents were curious, asking how he had managed to stop the HOA and prevent the construction of so many homes on private land. He shared the story carefully, emphasizing the importance of documentation, attention to detail, and persistence. It was not about fighting for the sake of conflict. It was about standing up for what was rightfully his. He also reflected on what this experience had taught him. He realized that quiet patience could be as powerful as bold action, that careful preparation could outweigh aggressive assumptions. He had learned the importance of history, of keeping records, and of understanding the laws that govern property. He had learned that standing firm, calmly, and consistently could overcome even the most confident opposition. The land itself seemed to breathe easier. Without the threat of construction, the natural rhythm of trees swaying in the wind, grass growing freely, and wildlife moving quietly was restored. He walked through it one afternoon, noticing a deer in the distance, a rabbit hopping through the grass, and the sunlight filtering through the trees. Each detail, each living thing, felt like a small celebration of the land's survival. He also thought about the future. While the legal battle had ended, he knew he needed to plan for long-term protection. Easements, legal notices, and careful record-keeping would ensure that the land remained secure for years to come. He began considering how to pass this property down to future generations, not just as land, but as a testament to patience, persistence, and respect for history. Over time, the story of the HOA's failed attempt became a quiet legend in the community. Neighbors would tell each other about the landowner who had stood firm, who had relied on deeds, maps, and careful preparation to protect what was rightfully his. It was a story of persistence and truth, of standing up for what belongs to you, and of using knowledge and patience as weapons in the face of assumption and authority, even in private moments. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The land had been quiet for decades, enduring changes around it, overlooked and underestimated. Now it was acknowledged, respected, and legally protected. Every hour of work, every visit to the county office, every meeting with attorneys, and every careful note he had made felt worthwhile. The battle had been long, but the outcome was clear. The land was safe. And he had won. He often returned to the same spot on the property, the edge where the wild grass met the trimmed lawns of the neighborhood. He would stand there quietly, watching the sunlight shift through the trees, listening to the distant sounds of the community and feeling the steady presence of the land beneath his feet. It was a place of peace now, no longer a front line in a battle for ownership. Looking back, he understood that this victory was not just about land or money. It was about respect for the past, recognition of truth, and the courage to stand firm when faced with overwhelming pressure. The deed, once a simple piece of paper, had become a symbol of justice and clarity. The land, once quiet and overlooked, had spoken through history, law, and evidence, and had been heard at last. Neighbors began to respect the boundaries more carefully. They understood the importance of the ruling and the consequences of ignoring it. Some even asked questions about the deed and the legal process, curious how one person had successfully challenged a powerful organization. He shared cautiously, emphasizing diligence and preparation over confrontation. He also thought about the lessons for others: documentation, careful research, and knowledge of one's rights could make the difference between losing everything and protecting what is yours. He hoped that sharing his story quietly and respectfully would inspire others to pay attention to their own property, to records, and to the details that often go unnoticed until it's too late. Over the months, life began to return to a quieter rhythm. The legal tension faded, replaced by a steady sense of security. The land remained as it had always been, steadfast, quiet, and resilient. But now, it carried a new weight, a sense of accomplishment, a recognition of victory, and the knowledge that one person could, with patience and truth, defend what is rightfully theirs. Finally, he allowed himself to relax, to walk the property without worry, to sit under a tree and watch the wind move the branches. He had faced letters, threats, assumptions, and legal challenges. He had spent months preparing, documenting, and fighting, and now the land was his, legally and unquestionably. The HOA's plans for 96 homes would not touch it. The deed had done its work, history had spoken, and justice had been served. The land had been patient, enduring decades of change and uncertainty. He had been patient, enduring months of stress and preparation, and together their patience had prevailed. Standing there, feeling the sun on his face, the wind through the trees, the steady ground beneath him, he finally allowed himself to feel a deep, lasting sense of peace. The fight was over. The land was safe, and the quiet property, which had waded through so much, could now remain just as it had always been, his protected and unbroken.